Hello, and welcome to this session on developing a research agenda for bridging peace and conflict studies and existential risk with Noah Taylor. Following a 10-minute talk by Noah, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where he will respond to your questions. You can submit questions in your name or anonymously using the box to the right-hand side of this video. You can also vote for your favorite questions to push them higher up the queue, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. And then after about 30 minutes of questions, I'll bring the Q&A to an end, but that's not the end of the session. To help you think through and apply the ideas you've heard, I'll be asking you to join a 20-minute icebreaker session where you'll have 2 speed meetings with other attendees to discuss your thoughts on the content. I'll explain how to do that when we get there. But now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Noah Taylor is a peace researcher and educator. He is a member of the core faculty for the UNESCO Chair for Peace Studies at the University of Innsbruck. His current research interests are bridging the field of existential risk with the field of peace and conflict studies. And he received his doctorate in peace, conflict and development studies from University Jaume in Spain. Here's Noah.
Hello everyone, my name is Noah Taylor, and today I will be outlining a research agenda for bridging the fields of peace and conflict studies and existential risk. For the past 12 years, I have worked in the field of peace and conflict studies, which broadly speaking is the interdisciplinary field encompassing systematic research on the teaching of the causes of conflict, war, and violence, and the conditions of peace. For much of that time, I have worked in the field of peace process support, where we try to help develop relationships between hard-to-reach actors such as military, non-state armed groups, and governments. I was tasked with staying abreast of the cutting edge in the field of peace and conflict theory, as well as building theory from lessons learned by networks of peace practitioners. Throughout this work, a splinter started to form in my mind. I could see clearly how theory in the field of peace and conflict studies was helpful in guiding actions and interventions in the present, and I saw how this theory was able to help us understand and work with the past. But I saw very little that dealt with the question of the future, both in the academic realm and from surveying practitioners themselves. I started to become interested in the field of existential risk and emerging technologies. Given the importance of the questions raised by these two fields, I was perplexed that these issues did not find attention in the field of peace and conflict studies. My hypothesis is that both fields can benefit from the lenses of the other. Peace studies from the field of existential risk through the adoption of future-oriented long-term lenses, and the field of existential risk through the examination of the complexities of peace and conflict. So existential risk frames the context of my research problem and can be understood as an event or phenomenon where adverse outcomes can permanently and drastically curtail human potential. Of course, living is dangerous and understanding risks is important. We can look at risks in terms of their scope, that is, the size of the group at risk, their intensity, how badly each group would be affected, their probability, what is our best current estimate of an adverse outcome. What I'm interested in is what happens when the scale is global and the scope hits terminal, where the X marks the spot. Many risks of global concern and intensity are endurable. This doesn't mean that waning biodiversity, moderate global warming, and global economic recessions would not cause untold misery or suffering, but at the global level, if these events are transitory, they are endurable, and that there will be a possibility for recovery. With existential risks, there is no possibility. Beyond the possibility of extinction, these risks curtail our ability to flourish, and thus, if gotten right, can be vehicles for transformation. What I am proposing is a mapping out of an initial set of research priorities for bridging the fields of existential risk and peace and conflict studies. An initial stage of mapping will be important for several reasons. First, both peace and conflict studies and existential risk are expansive fields, so in seeking to bridge them, we need to determine a set of priorities of research. Second, the knowledge needed to accurately assess these linkage points goes well beyond the scope of expertise of any single researcher, and will thus require the cooperation of a network of scholars and practitioners. And third, because the rapid rate of change and learning in such an effort will require large-scale collaboration. As a starting point, at the intersection between existential risk and peace and conflict studies, it would be important to figure out which are the most important questions to ask, how these questions should be prioritized, and of course, how they could be answered. So where to start is the prescient question. So from surveying the literature in both fields, I propose 4 initial lines of inquiry. The first related to great powers conflict, the second to pandemic, peace, and conflict, the third to climate change, existential risk, and conflict, and the fourth on emerging technology. These 4 research lines follow sets of questions that concern the relationship of conflict either directly or indirectly into issues of existential risk, and in each a more nuanced articulation and prioritization of the sub-questions as needed. If we take a look at our first line of inquiry, the question of great powers conflict, here we look into the likelihood of conflict between, for example, the United States and China, and if such a conflict were to occur, how likely is it to pose an existential risk, as well as what types of interventions, de-escalation, trust building, diplomacy, or other safeguards are likely to be the most effective at reducing the most risk. These questions will then break down into the nuances of the relationships of the different factors in the constellation. For example, if a great power conflict is not likely to be an existential risk itself, to what degree does it contribute to other risks, such as the use of weapons of mass destruction? Our second line of inquiry is, of course, the interrelationship between disease, peace, and conflict. We have seen how protracted violent conflict can lead to the destruction of health and sanitation infrastructure and the effects this can have on public health. And recently, we have seen the vast array of effects that a global-scale pandemic can have on our understanding of security. In this line of research, we would seek to untangle this web of relationships and develop answers to questions of to what degree does a global pandemic contribute or exacerbate violent conflict, and where do public health and peace-building measures most effectively overlap. Our third research line is structurally similar to our second and seeks to uncover the complex relationships between climate change, conflict, and existential risk. We are starting to see the influence of climate change sensitivity and how this is likely to make certain kinds of conflict more likely. We could also extend this examination of these variables to look into which ways would conflict and climate change form an insidious feedback loop that makes them more likely to become an existential risk. And our last line of inquiry revolves around the interaction between emerging technologies and peace and conflict studies. Emerging technologies are those whose potential are not fully recognized or yet understood, and are characterized by their novelty, fast growth, persistence, coherence amongst different research streams, wide range of impacts, their overall uncertainty and ambiguity, and the potential scale of their impact in the near future. Our key emerging technologies of focus are artificial intelligence, biotechnology, nanotechnology, and neurotechnology. I'll take a brief glance into each of these 4 areas. In the field of artificial intelligence, we can see questions of the ethics and the regulation of autonomous weapons, concerns about the possibility of an AI arms race, the use of AI technologies in mass surveillance systems, as well as questions related to the future of work. In the area of biotechnology, advances in gene editing such as CRISPR-9 allow us to edit the genome and germline of already living organisms. This brings into question our genetic future and how we want to shape it, as well as the security around many gain-of-function experiments, particularly those associated with the H5N1 virus. And we may also begin to question the ease by which one may be able to resurrect a virus, such as the Spanish flu, and call into question how these issues may lead to a restructuring of the types of actors and the scale of violence that is possible to be waged. In the area of nanotechnology, we're seeing the possibility of developments that rival the Philosopher's Stone. Techniques such as mature molecular manufacturing may allow us to produce anything from anything else, the effects of which we do not know yet. And finally, in the realm of neurotechnology, we see the possibility of dramatic cognitive enhancement and the questions surrounding the access to these technologies, as well as questions surrounding the boundaries between human and machine beginning to blur. With these 4 research streams, I proposed an initial set of research tools. First, I proposed the use of elicitive conflict mapping as an orienting framework for this research endeavor. In brief, elicitive conflict mapping was developed by the UNESCO Chair for Peace Studies and is oriented around 4 general categories of understanding peace. These are peace through justice, peace through balance, peace through truth, and peace through security, and look at how these understandings manifest and resonate at different levels of intra and interpersonal interaction. Our second tool would be a review of the existing literature in both fields with these key questions in mind, bringing a lens of peace and conflict studies into the literature surrounding existential risk, and conversely bringing the lens of existential risk into the literature of peace and conflict studies. Our third tool would be expert elicitation, This has already been widely deployed in the field of existential risk and emerging technologies and involves structured approaches such as the Delphi method for surveying thought leaders in this field in order to get an accurate picture of what possible trends are emerging or may emerge in the near future. And finally, the use of systems analysis methods, such as those developed by Collaborative Learning Projects Institute in the UK, which are methods of applying systems theory to issues of peace and conflict in order to determine what may be the most effective entry points to transforming conflict. This endeavor is still in its infancy and may lead to a large-scale research project or the foundation of a research institute. My hope in bringing it here today is to see how these ideas resonate with the larger effective altruism community and to receive feedback and ideas from such a large community of diverse sets of knowledge and life experiences. So I thank you for your time and I welcome any questions and feedback. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Noah. It's a fascinating talk and really interesting to see how peace and conflict studies fits across so many of the different existential risks that we talk about in the EA community. And I imagine the audience are relatively familiar with the kind of the field of existential risk and the work being done by organizations like the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford and the Centre for Study of Existential Risk at Cambridge. But perhaps what the audience aren't so familiar with is the field of peace and conflict studies. So could you tell us a bit more about what that community looks like, who the key players are, and what's happening in that space?
Sure, and thank you for that introduction, Barry. The field of peace and conflict studies as a codified field or as a distinct field is relatively new, starting maybe in the 1960s. But of course, we've been concerned about issues of peace and conflict since probably the beginning of human civilization. And we can see this evolution in peace studies thinking, starting as an evolution out of international relations and the difficulties international relations had in forming after the First World War and not being able to stop the Second World War from occurring, and seeing the horrors that came out of the Second World War. So originally, peace thinking started in this level of coming out of international relations and maintained a lot of that perspective. And then it became influenced by a combination of peace movements, the work of Gandhi and Martin Luther King and all of our famous peace activists, as well as a lot of the peace church traditions, such as the Quakers and the Mennonites. And then it started to, in the 1960s and 70s, become influenced by humanistic and transpersonal psychology, which brought a much more relational lens to the field. And then I think we're about to hit a new moment in the field of peace and conflict studies, where we are hopefully going to be bringing together many more perspectives than we had in the past. So I think if we were to look out throughout the main trends of peace work, we could think of it as if people are conceptualizing peace work in the terms of conflict management, and this would be the idea of dealing with conflict from a great powers perspective, that we're just managing the conflicts and trying to keep the violence down. And usually those who have the monopoly on violence and the ability to use power are the responsible ones for that. Versus those who maintain more of a conflict resolution approach, which sees conflict not necessarily as something to be suppressed, but as a problem to be solved. And these are the approaches that we see in negotiation and mediation. And then more recently, we have this perspective, which we call conflict transformation, which sees conflict as not necessarily bad, but an engine of change. So the idea is to take more of a facilitative approach in order to deal with conflict and try to change it away from violence and towards building a more peaceful and sustainable future.
Fantastic. And are there any particular institutions around the world that are seen as kind of the leading institutions in the field?
Certainly, there are a few. Probably the first one is the Peace Research Institute Oslo, or PRIO, which came out of Johan Galtung's work in the very beginning of codifying peace studies as a distinct field. And there you can find quite a lot of the holding of the perspective of peace and conflict studies. You can also see it in terms of a more quantitative approach in Sweden at the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, where they really try to crunch all of the numbers we have about conflict in order to look more predictably at the trends that exist. And then we can see other organizations. For example, in the UK, there is the Collaborative Learning Projects Association, which is oddly abbreviated CDA, but it is it has done a lot of practitioner research in order to look more specifically at the question of how do we know if peace work is effective or not, and trying to base that analysis on the findings from practitioners who have been in the field doing peace and conflict work.
Oh, that's fascinating. So is there any kind of strong evidence about particular interventions that do help to reduce conflict?
Yeah, this is one of the difficult issues to unpack in the field of peace and conflict studies, because if you take a very short-term approach and to your view of what peace work is, and you're just looking at how do we get parties to the table to implement a peace agreement, how do we get people to sign it, and is it then implemented? These can more or less be measured. You can look at ceasefire violations and you can track them across time. But if you want to say, how has this conflict been dealt with on the span of 20, 30, 40 years, or if we're really taking a multi-generational perspective, it becomes quite complex. And similarly, if we change our perspective from looking at outbreaks of direct violence and look into more of the structural or cultural forms of violence, then the question of determining effectiveness becomes much more complex. And I think that this is one of the areas where peace studies really needs to expand more and to bring more people who are skilled in quantitative analysis and able to bridge this kind of social sciences humanities with some of the more predictive techniques that we find in the EA community.
So that sets me up nicely to ask, your main focus of your talk is how we can bridge these two fields, existential risk and peace and conflict studies. And I wondered what challenges you've experienced in trying to bring together those two fields?
Certainly. I think that there are several layers of challenge. One has to do, similar to what I talked about before, this bringing a lens of long-termism or long-term thinking into the field of peace work. Where you normally find this lens is kind of more at an orientation of values. So a lot of peace workers will talk about working from the 200-year present. So everything you're doing in conflict intervention is related to 200 years before you and should be thought of as influencing 200 years in front of you, which is a nice idea and a good way of kind of emotionally or spiritually orienting yourself. But in terms of like what that means practically, in terms of how do we like look at timelines, becomes much more difficult. A second level of the answer is that there is not a lot of peace work that is solely peace work. It's often in a different frame, such as development or peace building or peacekeeping. And much of this work is tied into program funding cycles. So even though you may have this ideological vision of peace work as a 200-year now, when you're actually doing it, you need to write your proposal at the beginning of the year and get your funding and then do your reporting by the end of the year. And so part of the question is, how do we balance that? And then I think the third level is to bring more of this lens of long-term thinking to peace practitioners, because I think it can be quite easy to get quite a myopic view of dealing with conflict, because it's so overwhelming when you are really in a situation of active conflict that the only thing that really matters for you in that moment is the here and now. And that's of course understandable. But the question I think is also, how can we build the spaces for peace practitioners to be able to take the space to get a more expansive view about how they could extrapolate what they see in the field out into what might be coming in 2, 3, 5, 10, 15 years.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Noah. So I'm going to move us on to our first audience question now.
Oh, great.
So Ian asked, do you find a new Cold War between US and China likely?
I think this is a tremendously important question, given how the geopolitical scene has unfolded in the past year, but the past few years in general. And I think that part of the answer to that question will be around how we define the conflict that is arising. I think that it's quite unlikely to see a hot conflict in the traditional sense. But I do wonder also if the frame of what a Cold War is will change. Because I think our previous experience of Cold War is often this proxy conflict being fought in Africa or in Latin America. But I don't think the frame necessarily encapsulates things like cyber warfare or information warfare or economic warfare. And I think that what I understand about the Chinese approach to peace and conflict issues and also to approaches of development is never to go really directly against whatever the opposition is or what is perceived as the opposition, but to find ways around it. And so I think that part of how we will go about answering this question is expanding out how we would understand what that conflict would look like and how we would know when it is happening.
And what do you think are the broader implications for US and China relations in terms of long-term risk?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's one of the potential issues of a great power conflict is not necessarily that it is an existential risk in itself, but it can be a contributing factor on so many levels to all kinds of conflict, but also suffering and misery and lack of opportunity and lack of growth. And I think that this also calls for us to be creative in the ways that we approach peace building. You know, one of the main mitigating factors that we saw in the previous experience of Cold War is the connections made on track 2 or track 3 diplomacy between the US and the former Soviet Union. And so how do we build these connections between academics, between peace workers, between those involved in the different forms of NGO work or peace building work, or find creative solutions where there might be an easier way of countries being able to work together that is not in a very adversarial frame. So an example I can think of is that one of the only ways that peace building work is currently ongoing between the US and North Korea is in very small farming projects, because it's the only way to get kind of grassroots peace workers into the country to also be able to learn from the people there about their real situation, their own understandings of peace and conflict. So I would say that it calls for creativity, but also for establishing connections wherever we can make them.
And so for someone listening to this talk who wants to contribute to global peace and stability, do you think it's better for them to work in the military or the intelligence community or maybe in the government? Or would they be better placed in the civilian research sector or NGO sector?
I would say that the way that I understand peace and conflict studies is that it is more of a perspective that you maintain. So like in a similar way that people encounter mathematics, everyone takes math classes, but very few people get PhDs in mathematics. And this is the way that I understand peace work. And I would say that if you to whatever your natural inclination is or your natural interest is, to follow that. So if you have this interest to serve in the military, I think the idea of military as peace builders is very often underexplored. And there is quite a lot of potential there. In one of the programs that I work with the UNESCO chair in Innsbruck in Austria, one of the main tasks that they do is to run CIMIC trainings. So it's about how do you get civilians and military to work together? Because in the current situation of global conflict, there are many tasks that even peacekeeping forces can't do, that they rely on NGOs to do. But the NGOs also depend on the military or the peacekeeping forces in order to maintain security. So a lot of our training there is focused on how do we learn to work together in that way. Of course, one of the adages in peace studies is always start locally and learn locally. So if you're interested in peace issues, you don't necessarily need to wait till you get a great job with the UN, but to really see where you can work within your own community. Because it's amazing how often those learnings scale up in that, you know, what you learn about conflict in your own family or your own neighborhood or community, the dynamics of those conflicts, I don't think are that different than even geopolitical conflicts. I think the same main issues and the same main emotions drive them at all levels. And I think with the right kind of lens and the right kind of self-reflective capacity, you can pursue peace work in whichever way. That being said, I do think that one of the trends in peace work is that people tend to develop both a thematic focus and a regional focus, at least in the beginning. So if they were studying peace studies or a related field, they might focus specifically on post-conflict issues or gender studies, and then maybe pick a region like North Africa or Southeast Asia. And then for at least maybe the first 5-6 years of their career, that leads them into their first set of work where they can learn from their experience there and then expand out later into either further regions or further thematic issues.
Thank you. And I know like one of the big goals for you at this conference is identifying collaborators who can work with you on developing this research agenda. So could you tell us more about the kind of skills and expertise that you're looking for to help with this work?
Certainly. And I'm coming from the perspective of peace and conflict studies as someone who's super interested in issues of existential risk and emergent technology. And I'm a bit of a nerd, so I've read a lot of books and watched a lot of YouTube videos, and I'm always listening to a podcast. But getting people who are, number one, interested in this, but number two, have a bit of expertise on a particular issue. Like, I'm not going to be able to develop the background to understand the complexities of machine learning and AI, or all of the nuances in what a biosecurity perspective is, for example. So that's where I really look for collaborators, is to draw on their experience in trying to figure out how do we both set out these important questions, but what other ways can we go about looking at how we prioritize those questions.
Excellent. And in terms of prioritizing, I noticed in your talk, you kind of set out a few different models that you use in peace and conflict studies. And I wondered if maybe we could go into a bit more detail on some of those. So I remember the first one I saw was I think it was the trans-rational peace philosophy, where you were looking at a grid of justice and balance and truth and security. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Certainly. Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that sounds the most esoteric in peace studies, but is really, once it's explained, is quite common sense, in that the approach of the UNESCO chair and the 30 years of research they've done on peace really started with this question of, well, what is peace? If we're going to work for peace, what is it? And so, of course, there's a level where you realize that almost everyone has a different understanding of peace, because peace requires a perceiving subject or it doesn't exist. The notion of peace outside of something to experience it is pretty hard to imagine. Nonetheless, if after doing thousands of interviews, they've started to see there are general categories of how people tend to understand peace. But rather than category, we use the term peace family because it denotes a blurry boundary. So they often overlap. So we talk about the energetic, moral, modern, or postmodern understandings of peace, which of course come from different traditions, but are more easily expressed as peace as understood as balance or harmony, which I think is quite similar to how many people experience peace, but also the way that you would see understandings of peace in many different indigenous traditions or Taoist Buddhist traditions. Whereas the moral understanding of peace is the kind that you see particularly exposed in the monotheistic traditions, where peace is very deeply rooted in a notion of justice. Then we see the modern understandings of peace, of course, built in the modern scientific understanding of the world and the framework of the nation state, which sees peace as being primarily derived from security. And then what we would call the postmodern understanding of peace is derived from the understanding of plurality of truths. So what a transrational approach really means is just that we always try to keep all of these four understandings of peace in our analysis and look how they are being balanced or not balanced. So for example, in a situation where you have a lot of active armed conflict, the frame of peace, there's very often security, that we need to get the military in or the police in, and we need everything to be secure. But what you'll often find is a dramatic emphasis on security causes a decrease in emphasis on harmony. And that many people's social ties start to become stressed or break down, and many tensions arise in communities. So that's part of, in essence, the idea of the transrational approach to peace studies. And this ties into the next model that I mentioned, which is the elicitive conflict mapping, which is, in a way, how do we take everything we know about peace and try to apply it in a method of mapping? So elicitive conflict mapping is designed to be used in a specific episode of conflict and to unpack that conflict throughout these four understandings of peace, but also through multiple levels. And by levels, we could mean like what does the situation look like at the grassroots level, at the middle level actors level, and at the elite levels actors level. But then there's also this question of how in each conflict do the different layers of identity interact? So how are all of the layers of identity within myself? How are those connecting to the layer of interpersonal identity? And an example of that would be that when issues of trust are very prevalent in a conflict situation, trust or mistrust, you will often find emotions prevalent in people of belonging or lack of belonging or exclusion. And so this is what we mean by looking at different layers of the conflict as well. So the elicit conflict mapping method is to try to use all of these lenses to provide as robust of a picture as we can to get a sense of what that moment of conflict is like, and also to give us a sense of where some possibilities for conflict transformation might be.
Thanks for explaining those models in a bit more detail. And let me go back to some of the audience questions now. And one we've got here, you talk about kind of existential risk in peace and conflict studies, but Jacob's mentioned he'd like to see more attention to the risks of conflict leading to some kind of dictatorial lock-in or governance collapse. Yeah. So it's not an existential risk, but we end up trapped in a really bad situation. Have you looked into that area very much?
And that's one of the considerations that I have at the outset of this project. In my original conception of this a year ago, it was originally only focused on emerging technologies in peace and conflict studies. And then I thought to maybe go from this framework of existential risk, but I do have this question about how it excludes precisely issues like this. Whereas like locked into a totalitarian state of governance isn't necessarily an existential risk, but it certainly inhibits human thriving. And there's a great definition of violence by Marshall Rosenberg, the nonviolence communication person, who said that the best definition of violence is anything that inhibits human flourishing. And I would see then that this exact question would be a primary question for to be worked at in peace and conflict studies. And this is something I would like to work with others to really hammer out the nuances of these questions and what kind of implications come with our starting frame, and what starting frames might be the most useful. Like, is existential risk actually the best starting point, or is that a more important consideration to come later? Or maybe something that is more focused on human suffering, for example, is a better starting point, with existential risk becoming a secondary consideration. And I would love to hear other people's views on the same question as well.
Oh, fantastic. So yeah, if you do have views on that, make sure you reach out to Noah.
Yes, please.
So, a good question here is that how tractable do you think it is to work on great power conflict? It seems it can be very difficult to predict these conflicts, even let alone like prevent them from happening. Like, is there actually anything we can do as a community in this area?
Yeah, I think that there can be a huge feeling of frustration and powerlessness in these kinds of situations. My first introduction to the peace world was trying to work as an activist for stopping the US invasion of Iraq. And you could just see this whole war machinery being geared up and public opinion being swayed, and you felt really hopeless. And I think that the first step is, of course, to find a way to tap into reserves of strength to push beyond that. And then there's also the question of what realms of influence do you have? What if you are in the position to become someone who works in politics and you want to work at preventing a global conflict that way? I think that is really, if you can do that, it's a good way to go. But there is also quite a large international anti-war community and peace building community that you can tap into. There are some at the international level and also in certain regions trying to create a robust network of people at multiple different levels and different sectors. So how can we bring together people who do work in the intelligence community, the military, the NGOs, religious leaders, and what spaces do they have to actually work together? Because I think that is the only, for most people, that's the only avenue in, is through the horizontal connections. Though of course there's also voting, which is important when and where that is possible to keep issues of peace and conflict in your mind when you do go out to vote.
Absolutely. And Claire asked, are you aware of kind of any work that's being done in the field to reduce the likelihood that malevolent actors gain positions of power in society? So kind of working really upstream of the problem and just trying to prevent those actors getting into a position of power in the first place.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. One perspective that's quite prevalent in the community that works on peace processes is that there actually isn't such a thing as a conflict spoiler. It's that the people who are framed as conflict spoilers are often just unaddressed parties, or parties who are not being heard or needs are met. I don't know if that is true in all cases, but I have found that often what is seen as a conflict spoiler is someone that's been excluded from a peace process. But there is also the possibility of, I think when we look at the realm of corruption and criminality, in issues of peace and conflict, then you do have this issue of that people who may be intervening themselves in an ongoing peace process just to cause harm because it ensures that they'll continue to sell weapons or continue to sell drugs. This becomes quite an important issue, but is currently looked at in the realm of anti-corruption and not usually adequately addressed in the field of peace and conflict studies. But it would be interesting to look at how do we, if we're taking that question but looking more future oriented, how do we take what has been learned in the past on this particular issue and then extrapolate that out into maybe a set of guiding ideas for peace work in the future? It would be a very important question.
Thank you. And this is a quite a topical question, which is, do you think whichever country is the first to get a credible vaccination for COVID-19 will become the most powerful nation in the world? Or like, how do you see the geopolitics playing out with the vaccinations?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly whichever country, if it is a country that gets this vaccine, will wield a tremendous amount of power at the geopolitical level, let alone a huge amount of financial power. And I think we've seen, you can apply quite an apt lens throughout history in looking at how pandemics have shaped and reshaped national power structures and also international power structures. And I would venture to say that if it becomes an issue of conflict or not would depend a lot on how that country decides to use it. So you could imagine a country gaining the COVID vaccine and being quite generous with allowing people to use it in order to increase their moral standing in the geopolitical sphere, or to get a lot of good karma points that they're hoping to cash in later. But if it becomes a tool of bending other countries to their will, I think that it could be a huge source of conflict.
Okay, and so I want to finish off with some more questions about what individuals can do. So if you're an individual in China in particular, is there anything that you could be doing to reduce or eliminate the negative impacts of a great power conflict?
Yeah, I think that the bit that I know about the peace studies community in China is that the people in it are very motivated and really trying to expand it quite quickly. And if you get in touch with me, I can put you in touch with the people who are trying to start that up. And it seems, at least from an outsider, that in the universities is where a lot of this peace studies discourse is going. So that might be a place where there is a space for that kind of dialogue. What the question I would then have is where you could go from that and how it could be extrapolated to different kinds of community work. I don't really know what the space for community work is in China, but I do think that looking also at virtual options and how could we build together a US-China multi-track grassroots peace building networks could also be quite important for creating a robust system to be able to try to at least understand the incremental nature by which great power conflicts happen, but also how we might be able to intervene in it as it is increasing.
Great. And so just to finish us off then with the final question, for people who want to explore this field more and read up around different areas and do some more research, are there any particular books or articles that you would recommend, or particular questions for people to work on?
Mm-hmm. Well, in my view, one of the best book series for giving an overview of the entire field of peace and conflict studies is called the Many Pieces Trilogy, and is written by the UNESCO chair, Dr. Wolfgang Dietrich. I think is a pretty good one-stop shop to get a sense of what the field of peace studies is, and also what you could be, where you could go from there. I think that the works of Jean-Paul Lederach in the US also provide a really grounded and heart-oriented approach to how we understand peace work at the community level.
Brilliant, thank you. So that's concluding the Q&A part of this session, but don't go away just yet. Discussing new ideas with other people can be a really good way to help you understand them. So in the final 20 minutes of the session, you'll be having a couple of short speed meetings with other attendees. So if you check the session description below this video, you'll find a link to an icebreaker session, and that's where we're going to gather for those meetings. So please click on that link now, and a new host will meet you on the other side. And so thank you very much for watching.